Welcome everyone and happy National Fossil Day. I hope you have all been celebrating appropriately, whatever that means. But if not, that's what tonight's presentation is for after all. So my name is Marisa Gomez and I am the Public Programs Manager at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History, joined as always by our museum's Collections Manager Kathleen Aston for these collections close-up events. And we also have with us our special guest, Bobby Bozenecker. So hi, Bobby. Before I hand things over to Kathleen and Bobby, though, I do want to acknowledge that this series is a perk for our members whose support directly impacts the stewardship of the museum's collection. So I want to make sure you all know how deeply we appreciate you being a part of this community. And I'm going to share my screen one more time because I want to also acknowledge that the land on which the museum resides is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. Today, these lands are stewarded by the Amamutsin Land Trust, who are working hard to fulfill their obligation to Creator, to care for and steward Mother Earth and all living things through relearning efforts and the Amamutsin Land Trust. And just one more time for those of you who are just tuning in, we're going to be communicating using the chat today. We'd love for everyone to be able to be in conversation with each other. So if you want to make sure that your settings are switched from the option for hosts and panelists to everyone, that way everyone in the audience can communicate with each other. And if you have not yet, share your favorite fossil find. I saw that there were a couple ones coming in. Got seashells in Alessandra's yard up in Zayante, which is pretty cool. And then Vivian loves the fossils near Capitola, which I believe we're going to be talking about extensively today. So I'm going to start by handing things over to Kathleen, who's going to be sharing a little bit about why we love National Fossil Day, why we love fossils at the museum, and a little bit about our collections before we hand it over to learn more specifically about those fossils in Capitola from Bobby. So Kathleen, take it away.
Yeah, will do. Also, sorry, y'all, I lost one of my contact lenses, so I will be wearing my glasses today, which gives me a weird reflection eye. And I apologize for that presentation-wise. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so Marisa is right. We are super excited about National Fossil Day, which is a celebration that was created by the National Park Service to inspire excitement about paleontology and science, as well as to promote public awareness and stewardship of fossils, things we care about a lot in our national parks and beyond. So here's their really great logo for that. And I just kind of wanted to talk about the stories of sort of the people in the paleontology in our institution, because public investment is such a crucial part, such a crucial component for the preservation of our past, from advocating for resources that conserve fossils to investing in public lands, to ethical collection and donation of specimens to institutions. And so for activities associated with National Fossil Day, this is just a really cute photo, so I had to show it, or a cute illustration, include resources for learning about paleontology at home, virtual and physical events for students as well as lifelong learners, and an annual fossil art contest. So this is the 2021 winner for the 8 and under category. Anaya B. from Fremont illustrated a ranger and a member of the public studying prehistoric animals by land and sea at the Grand Canyon. And so if you are interested, you can look at our website for different fossil resources, but you can also check out the National Park Service. Getting a little bit closer to home, getting people excited about fossils in Santa Cruz is not hard, given the incredibly fossil-rich local landscape. So just to give a brief background, in Santa Cruz, you have 3 primary formations or distinctive units of rock that contain fossils. We can also call these Fossiliferous Formations, which is a relatively new word for me and now one of my favorites. So we've got the sparkling Santa Margarita sandstone, which can be found at places like the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve and the Graham Hill entrance to Henry Cowell. We have the finer grained, more yellowish Santa Cruz mudstone that can be readily found at Natural Bridges, Davenport, the Swift Street Outcrop, and Westcliff. And good places to find the youngest of these formations, which we will be talking about a lot more, are the blue-gray sandstone of the Purisima Formation, which you can find at Seabright Beach, Capitola Beach in New Brighton, and parts of Lighthouse Point. So one notable local fangirl of these formations was our very own Laura Hicox. So the museum's foundational collector moved into the Santa Cruz Lighthouse as a teenager when her father Adna was appointed Santa Cruz's first lightkeeper. So even before 29-year-old Laura would assume the same post, she had begun to amass a collection of beautiful and well-organized specimens. You can see these here on display in her famous Lighthouse Museum in the late 1880s. Of particular interest to Laura were fossils. She collected and cataloged specimens. She scrapbooked articles about them, and she even had a fossil named after her. So USGS scientist Ralph Arnold named the slendered whorled Fusus hicoxi, which is number 8 in this engraving, in honor of Miss Laura J.F. Hicox, United States lighthouse keeper, whose collection of specimens and interest in natural history has been an inspiration to all who have had the pleasure of her acquaintance. So Laura's story, which is that of an amateur or non-professional collector who participated in scientific conversations and inspired the public, even though the context for what was science was a little bit different then, is echoed throughout the history of our museum, from today's programs and exhibits, some of which you can see here, to our long history of passionate amateur collectors and generous, but also passionate paleontology professionals giving their time and in some cases their collections to us. So I just wanted to share a few highlights here, just a couple before we get into the real meat and potatoes of tonight's talk, of the people behind this paleontology, and throw in especially some examples of different specimens, folks who've contributed to our capacity to share the local fossil record for marine mammals. So we owe a lot of what we know about Laura's life to museum member Frank Perry, who also designed our permanent geology and paleontology exhibits, in addition to many other incredible feats, which we talk about periodically. And you can see him here constructing the Duciciron Jordani sea cow cast that hangs above our gift shop today. So the original specimen, which is stored at the UC Museum of Paleontology at Berkeley, was uncovered from the Santa Margarita Formation in Spats Valley. And so this animal is an extinct relative of today's manatees and dugongs, and it's an aquatic herbivore that would have lived between 10 and 12 million years ago. But while we do have that cast on public display, we have a number of other sea cow fossils in our collections in storage, many that were gifted by amateur collectors. From a similar time period, also from the Santa Margarita Formation, we have these fossils from fossil fans Harold and Gloria McGee, who are a husband and wife duo whose collection includes the teeth of the hippo-like, okay, I might get this wrong, Demosthelis hesperus?
Desmostylus.
Can you repeat that, Bobby?
Desmostylus.
Thank you. I thought I would get that wrong. And then also a tooth from its relative, which is the sort of more originally, especially very mysterious Paleoparadoxia genus, which you can find out a little bit more. I talk about that in the October Collections Close-Up blog. Some other examples. So we've got a lot of folks who have stories of finding fossils in the sandhills and quarries of the mountains, including my own mother, who was always sad that I had never found one as a child. I was more interested in like the coastal fossils that were more accessible to me by the time I started coming to Santa Cruz as a kid. But many other folks were also drawn to those Capitola cliffs in comparison to these sort of Santa Margarita formations you can find up in the mountains. And William Macy was one of these, who as a young man in the late 1930s, his passion for paleontology was like such a big deal that he was covered in the local paper. He found specimens like this fossil fur seal cranium, which helps us trace the lineage of the modern northern fur seal back 5 million years in the eastern North Pacific. You also have other folks, you have folks like William Macy, who were just really passionate from like childhood age, being very serious collectors. And you also have folks who were given a helping hand by local educators. So this is an article about how teacher William Miller not only found fossils and brought fossils to local fossils to museums, like this baleen whale ear bone, but he also brought his students out to fossils and was known for taking them on trips and getting them excited. One of those students was a local collector, and I think also a super passionate surfer. You know, people can be interested in all sorts of ways to use the coast, was Jack Neubert, who uncovered this Parapontoporia skull, which is an ancient dolphin. And like the 2 preceding specimens are currently on display in our permanent galleries, which give a bit of a sense of the incredible diversity of marine mammal life across time here on the Central Coast. And we're really excited for Bobby to come and fill out that the walrus fossil perspective today. And so, of course, some of these specimens are on display and we get to share them with people and get people really excited about them and invested in thinking about what it means to understand the history of life on Earth from fossils, what it means to steward them. But a lot of the fossils that we also have are in storage, where we're doing our best to curate them, digitize them, enhance our records about them, and make them available to scientists. So that includes this whale skull that is actually going to be the subject of an upcoming paper by tonight's guest, who is now going to share some of his more current research on walrus fossils. So with that, I'm going to give it away to you, Bobby. Stop sharing my screen.
All right, well, give me one moment here. All right. Is that up? All right, so thanks for having me, you guys. I'm Dr. Bobby Bozenecker from College of Charleston in South Carolina. I'm a Bay Area native, and I started out as an amateur paleontologist myself. And if you're growing up on the peninsula as a kid, there's not really a whole lot of natural history museums in Northern California. And when I was a kid, none that had any dinosaurs on display. And it wasn't until high school I realized, oh God, there's actually plenty of non-dinosaur vertebrate fossil sites in the area. So I started digging up shark teeth in Scotts Valley, like a lot of people in Santa Cruz do. And everybody seemed to know what the shark teeth were, but every time somebody would pick out a marine mammal fossil, they're like, I don't know, it's a sea cow tooth. And that bothered me. And it basically, led me down this rabbit hole of all the stuff people find alongside shark teeth, but don't really know what they are. And part of the reason is that, a lot of these marine mammal fossils need a lot of study. So in particular tonight, I'm going to talk about fossil walruses from Santa Cruz. Walruses obviously don't live in Santa Cruz anymore. And I'm going to try and answer that question as well. Why don't we have walruses along with sea otters in Monterey Bay today? Okay, so the modern walrus, it's a very charismatic, large species of pinniped. It's the third largest pinniped after the two species of elephant seals. We got the skeleton on the bottom. Obviously, it's dominated by those gigantic tusks, but a lot like a sea lion, it's got fore and hind flippers. Initially, they were misclassified as sirenians along with sea cows and manatees, but they are closely related to seals and sea lions. The walrus today lives entirely in the Northern Hemisphere, and there's this Mercator projection map showing their distribution, but a better way to think about it is this. So here's a polar projection, and we've got the two different subspecies of walruses. In blue, we have the Atlantic walrus, which is the one that's most commonly photographed. Svalbard, Nova Zemlya, Greenland, Canadian Arctic. And then we've got in green, the Pacific walrus, far eastern Russia, Alaska, etc. Very high latitude species. Walrus is basically tied to sea ice, which is a problem right now, but they weren't always tied to sea ice. Walruses are molluscivores. They feed entirely, or mostly anyway, on mollusks, and mostly bivalves. There's a captive specimen or individual, and we've got these small tusks sticking out. Walrus tusks are often surgically removed in captivity because they grind against the bottom of the concrete pools that they live in captivity, and that causes infections. So if you see walruses like the famous walrus at the Seattle Aquarium, E.T., that died a few years ago, they often don't have any tusks, and they're surgically removed to prevent disease. If you look further inside the mouth, you'll see that the top of the roof of the mouth is very highly vaulted, and there's a few teeth just sticking out there. They don't really use their teeth in feeding at all. If you look at a cross-section of the animal's skull, you can see that highly vaulted palate, and that palate allows the tongue to function as a piston, and it generates incredible suction. So what they do, they'll swim along the seafloor on the Bering Sea or elsewhere in their range, find a siphon of something like a gooey duck or a big cockle shell, and they'll just suck the siphon out. Sometimes, if it's a shallowly buried shell, they'll take the entire shell out, position it in their lips, and then they can suck all the meat out without the shell entering the walrus's mouth. So they don't use their teeth in feeding at all. One thing that's kind of weird for some of the species of bivalves with a really fleshy siphon that's really long, like a gooey duck on the West Coast, they'll just bite the siphon off and leave the siphonless clam in the sediment. I don't know if that kills the clam or not, but doesn't make a difference to the walrus's belly. Kind of messed up. Okay, so I mentioned that they are pinnipeds. Pinnipeds are a group of fin-footed carnivores. And there's two groups of carnivores. There's the Caeniformia, which is the dog-like carnivores, and the Feliformia, the cat-like carnivores. Things like mongoose, cats, hyenas, civets, etc., meerkats even, all form the Feliformia. Everything that's more closely related to dogs is in the Caeniformia, and this includes dogs, bears, weasels, red pandas, skunks, badgers, otters, etc., as well as the Pinnipedia. So there's walrus, Otobenidae there, and the rest of the pinnipeds. So modern pinnipeds include true seals or earless seals, and the eared seals or otariids, fur seals and sea lions. Now, I gotta give a quick primer on geologic time. You're gonna hear me using the terms Pliocene and Miocene quite a bit, as well as Pleistocene. So we've got 3 different geological eras here: the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. The Paleozoic is you can think of it as the age of fish. Mesozoic is the age of reptiles. It's when dinosaurs were around. And 65 million years ago, the Mesozoic ends with the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period. Non-avian, i.e. non-bird dinosaurs go extinct, and the Cenozoic begins, which is the age of mammals. The first walking whales show up during the early Eocene, about 54 million years ago, which is a lot earlier than the first pinnipeds, about 27 million years ago. We get some of the first fossil walruses about 16 to 17 million years ago, but we don't have the modern walrus genus Otobenians show up until the last 2 million years of Earth history. Most of the time we're going to be talking about is the last 10 million years. The very first pinniped, Enaliarctos, was quite small. It's known from rocks that are about 20 to 27 million years old, and only from California and Oregon. On the right, we've got a skull of Enaliarctos emlongi from coastal Oregon, and on the left, we have a skull of Enaliarctos mitchellii, and it's just the snout, so it doesn't have the brain case, but that's a cast of the specimen with my cat, Burt Reynolds, for scale, and Burt's right here. He's a large cat, admittedly, but that just shows how little these things were. They weren't much bigger than a sea otter. Now, as it turns out, there have been a ton of pinniped fossils collected from the North Pacific, and in particular, there's a really big diversity of fossil walruses. The earliest walruses show up about 16 million years ago, virtually at the same time in Japan and the west coast of the US. They have a long evolutionary history in the North Pacific. Tusks have evolved in 2 different groups of walruses. The big, long, vertical tusks in the Otobenians, which I'll talk about in a bit, and then short, forward-pointing upper and lower tusks in the Deus Ignathus walruses, which I'll also be talking about tonight. Prior to that, they looked a lot like sea lions. And then we didn't get any walruses in the North Atlantic or the Arctic until the last 5 million years. One of the Atlantic walruses, Ontocetus emensi, was originally misidentified as a fossil whale, hence the name cetus. Cetus is Latin for whale, but we're, owing to the rules of taxonomy, we're stuck with that name, even though we now know it's a walrus. So this is also the earliest fossil walrus to be discovered, and I mean historically early. It's only about 4 million years old, so it's not the oldest, but it is the first discovered. And on the bottom is a tusk my wife, Sarah, published on a few years ago, demonstrating that the species made it into the early part of the Ice Age. it's not very well known. It's not known for many skeletons. The North Atlantic record is pretty fragmentary. We're going to be talking about much nicer fossils from California. The Magoterian walruses are well represented in Japan, Oregon, and California. So we've got Otobenians in the back there, and that's Imagotaria-like walrus from Japan. Imagotaria downsii was originally discovered in the 1920s near Santa Barbara, and then now known for much better skulls from Scotts Valley. So this specimen on the lower left, I think, was collected from a quarry in De La Viaga Park, just a few miles away from y'all. A fossil found close to the base of the Santa Cruz Pier is Deus Ignathus Cruzensis. And this is a pretty strange specimen. It was sticking out of concretion found by a local amateur collector, I think in the 1920s, or maybe even the late teens. And the guy who found it poked it with a stick, and it quote unquote exploded out of the side of the cliff, according to an interview he gave with Frank Perry years ago. Deus Ignathus, the original specimen, is known from just these fragments, and it, based on the small canines, is a female specimen. We now have male specimens of different species of Deus Ignathus from Southern California. This is from the older part of the Purisima Formation. And this is a cast of what's called the holotype. Type specimen is the original specimen for which a species is based on. You'll hear me use the term holotype a little bit more tonight. And we'll come back to Deus Ignathus in a bit. Now, you add up all the fossil records from California, and we actually have a lot from many different rock units. So the Santa Margarita Formation has two different Imagoterian walruses. The Purisima has 4 species, including an Imagoterian, 2 Deus Ignathines, and at least 1 Otobenian. So 4 species, but there are some units that have 5 or even more species than that in these different groups. Now, a quick rundown of what happened in a very coarse sense over the course of walrus evolution. So we have these things like Proneotherium and Prototaria that show up about 16 to 17 million years ago. Proneotherium is from Oregon. Prototaria is from Japan. And they're very similar to Enaliarctos, and they're only a little bit larger. So these are seal or fur seal-like early walruses. The Imagoterians get a little bit bigger over the next 6 to 7 million years. And then we get some truly gigantic Imagoterians like Pontolus magnus from the late Miocene of Southern California and Oregon. Within the last 10 million years, we also have the first Deus Ignathine walruses to evolve, like Gomphotaria and Deus Ignathus. We already talked about Deus Ignathus Cruzensis. Gomphotaria is its much bigger cousin. Originally only known from Southern California, but now represented from California, or from the Purisima Formation of Santa Cruz as well. The Otobenians are the true tusked walruses. They only have upper tusks, and those upper tusks are typically quite long. These are only known from about the last 5 or 6 million years, and mostly from California, Japan, and the North Atlantic. So walruses start off as ecological generalists, so feeding on fish and squid, a bit like modern fur seals and harbor seals, and they don't get gigantic or ecologically specialized for feeding on mollusks until relatively recently. And of course, tusks evolved twice, which is really fascinating. And we're not entirely sure why the Deus Ignathines evolved lower tusks, but we'll talk more about that later. And one last note here, if you look at number 7 all the way in the lower right, that is Otobenians, which is the modern walrus, Otobenians rosmaris. Only Otobenians rosmaris is Arctic adapted. So we think that Arctic adaptations and, for glacial or periglacial environments is really, probably only happened in the last couple 100,000 years. Walruses used to be warm temperate to subtropical. And speaking of subtropical walruses, this is the Holotype Humerus, the upper arm bone of Valenectus Imperialis, found on the west, just to the west of the Salton Sea in Imperial County. That used to be what's now the Ignates Formation, was deposited about 4 to 6 million years ago in the Imperial Sea, which was a little arm of what's now the Sea, the Gulf of California, Sea of Cortez. At times, it was hypersaline, so very salty, much more salty than the Sea of Cortez is today, and possibly also landlocked. Valenectus Imperialis has this really massive humerus, and the bone is very dense, possibly acting as ballast to counteract how buoyant the animal must have been. Valenectus Imperialis is found alongside tropical mollusks like emperor helmet shells, which today are pretty much just in the Caribbean. So, and during the time, this is basically like a Caribbean-like biogeographic province, very different from rocks of the same age on the California coast. Speaking of which, the San Diego Formation is about the same age, and there's a rich fossil record of marine mammals from the San Diego Formation. San Diego Formation, very similar mollusks and marine mammals to the Purisima Formation, but a little bit warmer, warm temperate, but certainly not subtropical. This is a gray whale skeleton being excavated by the San Diego Natural History Museum, and all the hills just to the north of Balboa Park, Mission Valley, I think, and then down near Chula Vista, and then on down across the border into Mexico, have exposures of this Pliocene rock unit. This humerus on the left should look familiar. This is the humerus of Valenectus chulavistensis, named in the early 90s. Valenectus imperialensis was discovered in the 1950s, named in 1961, and it wasn't until 1984 that we had a faith to go with this really unusual humerus. So the second species, chulavistensis, was found with skulls, and this humerus on the left was found with this partial skull on the upper right. And we're looking at the skull, the left side of the skull, and that is a big tusk sticking out. On the lower right is another specimen, the paratype, found around the same time, and it's a juvenile male. And yeah, that looks a lot more like a modern walrus. So we now know that Valenictus is swimming around both the west coast of Southern California as well as the proto-Gulf of California. And we know that the holotype specimen, so the one on top, I've got the male symbol up there. We know it's a male because it's preserved with a baculum, which is the penis bone. Obviously, female specimens don't have that. And it's also got relatively large tusks. Modern walruses, the females have narrower tusks, often shorter. So you can estimate or assess the sex of fossil pinnipeds based upon the relative size of their canines. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Since 1994, a lot more fossils of Valenictus have been found, and there's now a composite skeleton mounted. Every single bone you see in this specimen is real. Actually, the flipper, the hands and feet, I think are actually casts. There's one beautiful female skeleton, and Tom Demeray, my colleague at San Diego Museum, didn't want to put the best hands and feet of this walrus on display. It is a pain to get into this case. You have to use suction cups, and the panes of glass weigh about 100 pounds. But just phenomenal material. Now, coming back north, the Purisima Formation, Kathleen talked about it a little bit. Here's an exposure near Half Moon Bay, where I did a lot of my undergraduate research. It's about 7 to 2.5 million years in age, so dating to the very end of the Miocene epoch and most of the Pliocene epoch. It represents continental shelf depositional settings. So as shallow as inner shelf, a lot of middle shelf deposits, and some outer shelf deposits as well. It's mostly sandstone and siltstone. There's a lot of fossil marine invertebrates. Marine invertebrates, including mostly mollusks, but also echinoderms, so like sand dollars, and then crustaceans have been discovered over the past 140 years from the Purisima Formation. My obsession with the Purisima Formation is that it's a really critical window into what marine mammal faunas looked like just before their fossil record gets terrible. And what I mean by that is at the end of the Pliocene, you have the initial glaciations of the ice ages starting in the Pleistocene epoch about 2 million years ago. And at that time, largely because of the lower sea level, the marine mammal fossil record kind of evaporates. So we can compare or infer what happened during this window by comparing the Purisima Formation fauna with the modern fauna. Most of the fossil sites in the Purisima Formation are coastal cliff exposures. Some of them are relatively easy to get to. Others are really deadly. And I'm sure there's lots of great marine mammal fossils at some of these sites, but I just won't go to them because, I don't have a death wish, or at least I have less of a death wish when I was in my 20s and had, a lot more bravado. But I get sore a lot more easily and my back hurts a lot more easily. So I go to the easier to get to sites these days. Speaking of which, different Purisima Formation localities that have produced fossil walruses include Point Reyes, Pillar Point, literally at the Fitzgerald Marine Preserve, San Gregorio, Pomponio, Pescadero State Beaches, so southern Half Moon Bay, and then of course Santa Cruz. Most of these sites, aside from the Santa Cruz sites, require either National Park Service permits or California State Park permits. So if you see fossils at any of these sites, go ahead and call a paleontologist, and they'll be able to get the necessary permission to collect them. Purisima Formation exposures, by the way, are chopped up by a bunch of different faults. So we've got the Zayante Fault in northern Santa Cruz County, and then the San Gregorio Fault, and the San Andreas itself. So the Purisima Formation is a bit messed up in terms of, it's hard also to correlate the different sections. In each locality, it looks really different. So there might have been a lot more, and now it's all sheared apart. And for example, in the La Honda block, there's like 3,000 meters of Purisima Formation, where there's only like 100 meters or maybe 300 meters in Santa Cruz and the San Gregorio section. Now, obviously, during the Pliocene, California looked a lot different. So the modern transverse ranges that are sort of, just around Santa Barbara, they were sort of a peninsula or an island sticking out into the Pacific. The Channel Islands are not where they are today. And there's this big embayment on the left, and that embayment is what is now the southern San Joaquin Valley. On the right-hand side, this is technically during the last glacial maximum, so about 27,000 years ago, but California basically looks the same as it did during the Ice Age. Sea level is a little bit higher now. And actually, if you look, some of the Channel Islands are connected to Santa Barbara, which is how some of the pygmy mammoths made it out there and got stranded and then, shrunk. A lot of you guys might be familiar with the Purisima Formation exposures at Capitola. This is one of my favorite fossil sites in the world. The rocks here date from about 3.5 to just about 5 million years. So a narrow window of time, about 1.5 to 2 million years of Earth's history represented. Most people notice the fossil shells, and these shells are often in little shell beds. Some shell beds as thin as a centimeter, others up to about 20, 30 centimeters thick. So up to about a foot thick, like the one on the bottom here. However, I go looking for vertebrate fossils. So you can find shark teeth, whale bones, often they're in concretions. And in 2010, 13-year-old forest shepherd who lived at the time in, I think, Pleasure Point, found this concretion. Unfortunately, I didn't get any photos of it before I started preparing it, but there wasn't a whole lot exposed. This concretion was about 2 feet long and about 1.5 feet wide, and it weighed about 75 pounds, which quite frankly was probably more than forest weight at the time. So being a resourceful young man, he got his dad to lug this thing off the beach. It's an extremely hard sandstone, so he contacted me and I asked if he would donate it to UC Berkeley, and he agreed. So I picked it up, drove it back to Montana, and I started cleaning it up using a lot of different tools, including hammer and chisel, this thing called a microjack, which is basically a handheld jackhammer, and then an air scribe, which is what these smaller lines are in the limestone, or sandstone, I should say. And air scribes are basically a little tiny handheld jackhammer that's the size of a really big Sharpie pen. And they just zip right through the rock. It was really, really slow going, and I ran out of time because I had to go to New Zealand for my PhD in early 2012. This is what it looked like when I left for New Zealand, and that looks a little bit more like a walrus skull. So we got the nose on the right, eye socket filled in with rock there, kind of in the middle, just below that rusty patch, and then the brain case is at the upper left. And this is what it looked like when I left for New Zealand, and when it arrived for me in the mail in 2016, and I immediately started chiseling it down. This is behind our building. This was July. I don't know why I was wearing pants. It was about 80 degrees and 90% humidity outside. I had to take a shower after, but this rock is just really nasty to get through. So I used a little help from chemistry. I have become obsessed with acid preparation. Anytime you have a fossil that is preserved in calcium carbonate, so the same mineral as calcite or limestone, you can just soak it in a weak organic acid like acetic acid, which is vinegar, and it tends to attack the rock at a faster rate than it attacks the bone, or sometimes it doesn't attack the bone at all. I got really lucky in this case. About 90% of the concretion was soluble in vinegar. This is 10% acetic, so what you get off the shelf is 5%. So I have to go once every couple of weeks downstairs and put on all my PPE, goggles, lab coat, work in a fume hood so I don't die from respiratory failure, and mix 100% glacial acetic acid into 10%. And then I would take the skull out about once a month, brush off all the loosened sandstone, put it back in, put in fresh acid, so on and so forth. So this series of photographs shows the final 3 months of acid preparation. And on the lower right is a photograph I took just about 2 weeks ago. This is a forest skull. Now, this specimen is a new species of Valenictus. It potentially could be Valenectus Imperialist, but I doubt it. We don't have a skull of Valenectus Imperialist, so it's impossible to know. The skull, however, does have some differences with Valenictus chulevistensis from San Diego. We know based upon the narrow size of the canines, which you'll see in a minute, or at least the canine sockets, that it is a female. But one thing that's really neat is that the specimen is about 25% bigger than all of the female specimens at the San Diego Natural History Museum. So this species is a lot larger than Chula vistensis. So to orient you, that black gaping hole in the middle, that is the hole behind the eye socket. That circular structure right there is the eye socket. The gray patch just to the right-hand side, that is the nose. And then the mouth is kind of at the lower right. Here's a view from the front, looking right down it. And you can see this process of bones sticking down on either side of the mouth. That is the buttress that forms around the tusk. And straight away, you can see they are quite narrow from side to side. So that is a feature of female tusked walruses. They tend to have much narrower tusks. And Otobenian walruses have this buttress of bones sticking out as well. Curiously enough, the eye sockets do face a little bit forward. Modern walruses have somewhat binocular vision. They can actually take their eyeballs and stick them out. They actually protrude their eyeballs from their eye sockets so they can actually look around that big old muzzle they have. And we actually think, based upon some features of the eye sockets, that Valenictus was able to do that. You know, and that's only because we have a really well-preserved eye socket in this skull. And here's the view from the bottom. So one thing I didn't bother mentioning is that Valenictus is a toothless walrus. It has tusk sockets, and that's it. So we can see the feature labeled alveolus up top. That is the left and right tusk socket. And there should be 5 or 6 tooth sockets, inboard of that on either side. Valenictus has no other teeth. So it lost all of its other teeth, which makes it technically more evolutionarily derived than the modern walrus, or more specialized anyway. I mentioned that walruses today do not use their teeth in feeding. Valenictus was a suction feeder as well, killing defenseless mollusks left and right. The modern walrus only uses its teeth for communication. It'll clack its teeth together underwater, which actually sounds like if you take two 2x4s and you bang them together, it sounds a lot like that. Whatever Valenictus was doing, it obviously couldn't communicate like that. But the modern walrus has already lost several tooth positions anyway, relative to sea lions and true seals. So it's not inconceivable that this could have happened if you didn't know about the fossil record of toothless walruses. Now, this species is a little bit older than Valenictus chulavistensis. And it's got larger blood vessel holes in the palate. And those blood vessel holes, we think, might correspond to the blood vessels that feed the teeth. So, and the blood vessel holes seem to be symmetrical left and right, whereas the pattern is a lot more chaotic. So maybe it suggests that this is closer to the toothed ancestor of Valenictus. And you guys have a skull, a cast of a skull of Valenictus on display. This one is a couple million years younger and is smaller. It's also a female specimen, and it's got narrow canine sockets. But all of the little differences we've noticed between forest shepherd skull and Valenictus chulavistensis, they're not present in this specimen. So this specimen, we think, is a Northern California record of the San Diego species, Valenictus chulavistensis. This specimen was found in the 1980s by Eric Berman, actually pretty close to the museum. Let's see. So this specimen's younger, the new species is older, so we already have a little bit of walrus chronology just in the Pliocene part of the Purisima Formation. There are other specimens as well. On the left-hand side, in the Santa Cruz Museum collection, is this partial femur collected by local collector and surfer Dave Landis. Dave collected this, I think, back in the early 2000s and happily donated it. Based on comparison with fossils from San Diego, we know that this is a femur or thigh bone of Valenictus. It's very shortened and it's very, very dense. So our species of Valenictus had dense bones, just like the specimens from San Diego and the Imperial Formation. And on the right is an ankle bone collected by school teacher Wayne Thompson. Wayne collected this and donated it back in 2016, and I published it in the in-house journal at Berkeley, Paleobios, in 2017. Leaving the tusked walruses, or the Otobenians, and moving to the double tusked walruses, I already talked about Deus Ignathus Santa Cruzensis. More recently, fossils of a different species have been found in the San Diego Formation. Now, we should expect to find this species eventually at places like Capitola that are the same age, and I have found some fragments attributable to this species from Half Moon Bay, where the rocks are also younger. But this is a male skull of Deus Ignathus septeni, and it's got short tusks, quite a bit of wear, but also would have had lower tusks. And you can sort of see that a little bit on the bottom. There is a big canine sticking out, but it's broken off. And the upper tusk is quite small, but it sticks out forward a little bit, which is really unusual when you look at a modern sea lion. Their teeth kind of stick straight up and down, which is better for biting something anyway. So we think that Deus Ignathine walruses use their unusually forward sticking tusks, perhaps for social reasons. This specimen, including a couple more mandibles, also of a female, was found during construction of Scotts Valley High School. The Purisima Formation is exposed up in Scotts Valley as well. It's just not, it's usually covered in a lot of poison oak, and I'm not going anywhere near that. Frank has a little more courage about that sort of thing than I do. Now, this specimen's at the San Diego Museum of Natural History because they did paleo mitigation, where they had a paleontologist on site during construction. And then there's this spectacular beast. This is the fearsome skull of Gomphotaria pugnax. The skull is about 2 feet long. It's just enormous. Each of those tusks is like the size of a large cucumber. I think the upper tusk is literally like the size of my wrist. The mandibles have beautiful lower tusks. This is what you would be looking at 6 to 7 million years ago if you came face to face with one of these while swimming. It also has a really big sagittal crest for jaw attachment muscles, kind of like a modern California sea lion. The original specimen is a male, we know thanks to the penis bone, and it's from the Capistrano Formation, which is a lot siltier than the Purisima Formation, but they're about the same age. Now, on the lower right, we've got a new species of Gomphotaria discovered by our very own Frank Perry. Frank found the skull in a big concretion, and it was prepared using mechanical preparation and acid at the LA County Museum of Natural History, and now is a UCMP specimen. So I'm currently studying this with several of my colleagues, and it is almost as big as Gomphotaria pugnax. Unfortunately, we don't have any tusks for it. We have found isolated tusks, though, and I used to think that this was the male tusk of Deus Ignathus Santa Cruzensis. I found these are 2 associated specimens. I dug these out actually only a month before that pregnant fur seal skeleton I mentioned earlier, and I've gone back many times with the curator of the San Diego Museum, who named Valenictus chulevicensis and the other species of Deus Ignathus, whether or not the straight one was the lower tusk or the upper tusk. And I eventually realized that this has to be Gomphotaria, which would make the more curved tusk the upper one and the straight tusk the lower one. And sure enough, it matches the socket size of Frank Perry's skull. I also found this adorable smaller female tusk that is narrower and shorter than the male upper tusk there on the upper, just next to it. So we've got female and male specimens. Here's the skull from the top. That big old cavity on either side of the skull is both the eye socket, but also the area where all the jaw muscles anchor in. So this animal is not packing much in brain power. The brain case is on the right. The brain case is very small, but just an incredible amount of muscle in the head devoted towards the jaw closing muscles. And possibly, these animals might have been fighting a bit like elephant seals. And if we look at the palate, one thing that's interesting, the new species has the teeth arranged in an arc, whereas they're arranged in a straight line in Gomphotaria pugnax. But neither specimen has a really great bottom side of the skull, unfortunately. Now, if we take a broader view, this is an evolutionary tree of walrus relationships. So the closer they are on what we call this a cladogram, the closer they are, the closer the relationship. So we have Deus Ignathus and Cruzensis there, Gomphotaria right there, and that whole group there is called the Deus Ignathinae, or Deus Ignathines. And then within the Otobenians, we have Valenictus there, and Valenictus is most closely related to Pliopedia, which is a poorly known walrus from basically like San Luis Obispo area and Kettleman Hills near like Kettleman City. And then the modern walrus, Otobenians rosmarus. Now, fossils of Valenictus have been found in the early and the late Pliocene in different parts of California. So during the early Pliocene, we have fossils of Valenictus in the Gulf of California, down there where it says Imperial Group, as well as the Purisima. And the Purisima at that time was the mouth of this embayment occupying most of the San Joaquin Valley, southern San Joaquin Valley anyway. And about 3 million years ago, it dried up. We've got fossil walruses during the last stages of marine water in this San Joaquin Formation. Basically the last remnant of that embayment. We also have fossil walrus Valenictus in the Prisma Formation down by San Luis Obispo, and of course in the San Diego Formation as well. And then if we skip forward to the last 100,000 years, we get fossil Otobenians rosmarus, so the modern walrus living as far south as San Francisco. And we're not sure if these are interglacial or glacial periods. They're not dated well enough. If they are interglacial in age, then it means modern walruses were living here during conditions only slightly colder than today. But if they're glacial, then it means that they were adapted to the same climate as they are today during the Ice Age. But, the Sangamonian interglacial, which is about, I think, like 130,000 years ago, was slightly warmer than today. So if walruses were living off our coast then they weren't a whole lot different from Valenictus. So why don't we have any walruses on our coast today? One major difference is geography. There aren't a whole lot of big embayments on the California coastline today. We've got a bit of continental shelf in Monterey Bay. There's the Humboldt Shelf up by Eureka, and then parts around the LA Basin. But we had a lot more continental shelf during the Pliocene. So if we outline just part of the continental shelf that's been lost since the Pliocene. We have all that in yellow on the right-hand side. That's 20,000 kilometers of shelf that was lost. And if you remember, these walruses, they're eating mollusks. So they are tied to the seafloor, and they can't really dive deeper than about 20, 30 meters or so. I think the deepest modern walrus dives are about 50 meters. Most of the California continental shelf is a lot deeper than that. And we actually think that, these periods of low sea level during the Pleistocene, that the glacial periods during the Ice Age, would have reduced a lot of available shelf space for gray whales, and gray whales probably almost went extinct during the Ice Ages. Now, it turns out that Valenictus wasn't alone. There are some real weird marine mammals living in the Pliocene of California, thanks to the fossil record of the Purisima and the San Diego Formation. That skull that Kathleen showed, collected by Jack Newbert back in the 40s, I think, is a specimen of Parapontoporia. Parapontoporia is very extinct, and it's the closest modern relative, closest relative of the recently extinct Chinese river dolphin that went extinct just about 10 years ago. So that group used to have a circum-North Pacific distribution. We think it was primarily coastal, and maybe coastal and living in rivers. Semirostrum is this bizarre porpoise that had a paddle on its chin that it probably used to plow through sediment. We think maybe ate marine invertebrates thanks to tooth wear on its teeth. Deus Ignathus seftoni and Santa Cruzensis. We're not sure if the Deus Ignathians were molluscivores. Gomphotaria probably was. So we're not too sure about whether or not it's tied to shallow marine environments or not. But Herpetocetus certainly was. Herpetocetus was probably a gray whale like baleen whale, but only about 4 meters long, 4 to 5 meters, and it could only open its mouth about 15 degrees based on a really weird jaw joint it had. So it was a dedicated suction feeder. And we think it went extinct during the Ice Ages because of the loss of suitable shallow embayments with rich and productive marine invertebrate populations. And one thing I forgot to mention, 20,000 kilometers, there's only about 56,000 kilometers of continental shelf between Baja California, Oregon, and Washington today. So if you add those together, we're talking about losing like 1/3 of all continental shelf between 3 and 2 million years ago, which is devastating for a lot of these highly specialized marine mammals. Today, we have a very different fauna, and you might think of things like harbor seals, elephant seals, sea otters, and sea lions. They are big, charismatic marine carnivores. Sea otters are particularly emblematic of Monterey Bay, but they're all newcomers. None of these species have a fossil record in the eastern North Pacific to from Alaska to Baja California, more than about 600,000 years old. These are all recent invaders. They have no fossil record during the Pliocene. So there seems to be an undetected extinction event or period of time with rapid faunal overturn, and the fossil record is still too poor to tell the difference between the two. But we had this shallow marine mollusk eating, all sorts of weird specialists that lived during the Pliocene. They all die off. The modern gray whale is sort of a relic, but even it's also a Japanese immigrant. You find it in rocks as old as the Purisima in Japan, and it only shows up here about 1 million years ago. The oldest known sea otter is from near San Francisco, and I published it a few years ago, and it's only 600,000 years old. The oldest known sea lions from the East Pacific, 700,000 years. And it's even worse for seals. The oldest known elephant seals are only like 200,000 years old. Oldest known harbor seals about 500,000 years old. Everything aside from the elephant seal evolved either in the Arctic or Japan and immigrated here during the Middle Pleistocene. Elephant seals crossed the equator from the Southern Ocean sometime in the last 300,000 years. And again, I think this is related to changes in the geography of the coastline. On the top, we've got Scammons Lagoon, the famous place where the breeding ground of gray whales was discovered and the water turned red in the 1850s. Scammon was there documenting, and gray whales were declared extinct for a while and rediscovered. Just like elephant seals, the Juan Hernandez fur seal, Townsend's fur seal, and the sea otter. So we had during the Pliocene a lot of shallow, soft bottom, muddy embayments that were rich, very rich in benthos. So lots of bivalves to eat, lots of snails, and really low gradient, really flat, wide embayments. A lot like modern Scammon's Lagoon. And those are all gone now. Possibly why gray whales travel that far south to breed. There was a thing in the news recently about Puget Sound being a stopover for gray whales. Puget Sound is kind of an analog for what a lot of these embayments were like. Protected, but wide and shallow and very muddy. And gray whales, turns out they stop at Puget Sound for a couple weeks to fatten up, and they just eat mud shrimp, which we have plenty of fossils of in the Purisima, by the way, which is very interesting. Today, on the other hand, we have no more embayments. The coastline is very rocky. We've got a very narrow continental shelf, with a rich kelp forest fauna. No more bottom-feeding marine mammals. And the few bottom-feeding marine mammals we have, like gray whales, they just don't even stop. They just keep trucking up the coast until they hit a place like, well, a Pliocene-style embayment like Puget Sound. Or we'll have sea otters, which again are recent immigrants, and they don't just eat mollusks and sea urchins. They eat a lot of different things, and individual sea otters will be specialized. And then we've got a lot of things that haul out on rocks, but mostly swim offshore and eat fish and squid offshore, like elephant seals, sea lions, fur seals, etc. And the cetacean fauna is very different. So that's what we think about the fossil history of pinnipeds, marine mammals, and in particular walruses from Santa Cruz. I'd like to thank all of the different amateur and professional collectors who discovered and donated fossils: Forrest Shepard, Frank Perry, Wayne Thompson, Dave Landis. I'd like to thank my research partners, Morgan, Ash, Sarah, and Frank. And then different museums like UCMP, Santa Cruz Museum, obviously, LACM, and the San Diego Natural History Museum. And I'd like to thank Kathleen and Marisa for hosting this and inviting me. And thanks to all of you. And if there's time, I'd be happy to entertain some questions.
Thank you, Bobby. It got dark all of a sudden here on the West Coast. I know Bobby's on the East Coast. It's been dark there for quite some time. Thank you so much. That's fascinating and really, makes sense why things look so different now from what they used to. I do not believe have any questions that have come in from the chat yet, but now's the time, folks. If you have a question for Bobby, please write it down. Kathleen, do you have any questions?
Well, so I had some just sort of like general questions, but I feel like I have a lot more now, which is very exciting. I guess I was learning about something to do with bone density for different kinds of marine mammals recently, and I was wondering if you do whales have a similar thing where they're really dense? Because I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like that as like a way that different kinds of marine mammals, like the density of their bones, and whether or not that plays into like how, when you're in the field keying out different fossils, you can tell what you're looking at?
That's an excellent question. And whales did at one point have very dense bones, and it's basically a phase that a lot of marine tetrapods in general go through. And we think it's tied to diving while you still have lungs full of air. You've got, if your lungs are full of air, you're doing shallow diving, you need to compensate in order to be neutrally or negatively buoyant by adding weight somehow. So the easiest way is just to grow super dense bones. It probably has an energetic cost for swimming because it's a little bit more mass to be moving around, but virtually every single group of marine reptiles that has ever evolved went through a dense boned early phase. Sea cows, so manatees, dugongs, and the extinct stellar sea cow, they all have dense bones. They still have dense bones, and they've never had to evolve deep diving because all their food is in the photic zone. Walruses have dense bones because, one, they're shallow divers, and most of the clams they eat are under 20 meters water depth. And it helps keep their foraging sessions longer because they're not having to fight floating, essentially. Early pinnipeds went through a dense bone phase, but then things like elephant seals, which have prolonged dives, and harbor seals as well, have evolved the opposite, lighter than average bones that are basically like styrofoam. And that's because when they dive, their lungs collapse. So you no longer have that all that gas that's buoying you up. And that lung collapse has evolved independently also in beach whales, some blackfish like pilot whales, as well as sperm whales, and a couple other fossil groups. And there's a couple of fossil groups of odontocetes, toothed whales, that then re-evolved dense bones.
Okay. I'm going to have to take notes on that when I go back and listen to the recording, which will be available for the folks at home.
Yeah, we'll be adding it up and
Interesting.
I'll send a link out in a follow-up survey email. There'll be some other resources in there too, but if you want to go back and watch the recording, that'll be included. And we have had a couple of questions come in through the chat. One is from an 8-year-old fossil hunter who lives in Zayante, and she finds seashells in her yard. And she's curious if it's likely that the fossils that her and her family find are from the Purisima Formation, or maybe they're from the Santa Margarita. Do you have a sense if there's seashells in Zayante?
If they're in Zayante proper, then it's almost certainly going to be the Santa Margarita sandstone. So the easiest way to tell the difference between the Santa Margarita and the Purisima, the Santa Margarita is like beach sand. You can crumble it with your hands. And the most common fossils in the Santa Margarita sandstone are little sand dollars that are about 2 inches in diameter. That's called Astrodapsis fasciosus. And it's an extinct type of sand dollar. They're a little bit thicker, almost look like a cookie, unlike the modern Dendraster eccentricus, which has the really sharp edge. The Purisima Formation is often going to be dark gray when it's freshly exposed, but it can look as light as the Santa Margarita, but it is hard and it's kind of chunky and difficult to dig through. And most of the fossils are bivalve shells, so clam shells. So using that bit of information, you should be able to easily figure out which of those two units. Oh, we are finding what look like bivalves.
Yeah.
If you're finding bivalves and the rock isn't really you can't crumble it like easily, then I'd say it's, if you can't crumble it, I would say it's probably the Purisima Formation.
And what I'll say too is that Alessandra, I don't know if you have watched the museum's Rockin' Pop-Ups that we have with Gavin and Graham, the geology gents. But we do those every month, and we accept photo submissions for that. So Gavin and Graham will look at the photos that you submit, and you can just send those to my email address. I'm the one that's emailing you, or the events@santacruzmuseum.org email, and I'd be happy to share them with Gavin and Graham too at our next pop-up. And there's also going to be some other resources that we'll send in our follow-up email. And let's see, we've also got some other questions that came up. Let's see, from Anna.
I see I'm about to be grilled by my colleagues, Dan and Anna.
I know, I'm going to go to Anna's first. So Anna's curious about the skeleton of the female fur seal that you mentioned kind of before we got started when we were talking about our favorite fossils. Is it displayed somewhere? Can we see it?
First off, hola, Anita. So that specimen is stored at UCMP, and it's not on display anywhere. And quite frankly, the bones they're not pretty. It's found in the diatomite of the lower part of the unit. So diatomite is fossil plankton. And that means that the fossils are often pretty pancaked, and the skull, it's got the brain case, and the brain case has actually been foreshortened to half of its original size, and it's literally wrinkled like an accordion, which means I didn't even realize it was a skull when I was preparing it. So it is a pregnant specimen, and it does require some study, but I would not fault any curator for looking at it and saying, I'm not going to put that on display. But I might suggest that a temporary exhibit at Santa Cruz Museum would be really cool.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's talk. All right, let's get into the doozies from Dan. So Dan says that based on your talk, it seems that, oh gosh, Otariids were not present at the same time as the peak in walrus diversity. So can you speak to that, since there seems to be extreme or extensive records early?
So there's a bit of a taxonomic issue here, and Otariids for everybody else are the eared seals, the fur seals, and sea lions. Larry Barnes, who is the former curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History, used to call all walruses, as well as the earliest pinnipeds and Enaliartines, and a couple other groups, he lumped them all into the Otariids, basically to make that diversity sort of equivalent to the diversity you see in the family Phocidae, the earless seals. So if you look in older papers, there are a lot of early walruses that are classified as Otariids, and we don't really use that classification anymore. So if you specifically just look at what Larry Barnes would call the Otariinae, which is Otariidae of current usage, the earliest known fur seal is Eotaria crypta, and that's about 17 million years old from Orange County. And then there's about like a 3 or 4 million year gap until you get to Cenozoic from the same rocks as Imagataria, the early walrus in Scotts Valley and Santa Barbara. And then it's a couple million years and you get the genus Thalassaleon, which is the genus that includes the pregnant fur seal. And it's the fur seal that probably gave rise to the modern northern fur seal, Calorinus. There's a few species of Thalassaleon, but basically during the middle Miocene, you have one species of Otariid. During the late Miocene, you have one and then two species, and then a few species during the Pliocene, and then you have most modern genera appearing during the Pleistocene. So the fossil record of Otariids is really scrappy. And basically the bottom line is walruses were probably inhabiting all of the niches now inhabited in the North Pacific by sea lions, harbor seals, elephant seals, with like one fur seal hanging out as a bit of an imposter in the group at any of those times.
And so this, Dan's other question kind of, I've been wondering about this too, about how confident you are that that they've been doing the same foraging pattern like throughout all of this time and all of these changes. I was like thinking about this specifically with the examples that had the really extreme sagittal crest, and how like your theory is that they are fighting kind of like elephant seals would fight. I'm familiar with really big sagittal crests being associated with like carnivores. Is there any, like, is it possible that there is any other sort of like variety of feeding patterns for these different species that differ from what we're familiar with walruses?
Absolutely. So we think that Imagatorian walruses, which do not have tusks, and they have seal or sea lion-like teeth, were probably generalist fish eaters, just like modern fur seals, sea lions, and harbor seals. And then the Deus Ignathus walruses, the ones with the upper and lower tusks, they have teeth that are, aside from the tusks, the cheek teeth are really similar to a modern walrus, and they're highly worn down, which suggests that there's a lot of substrate getting into the mouth. Larry Barnes, when he named Gomphotaria, he actually suggested they were biting mollusks, but you could be ingesting sand through suction feeding and wear the teeth down that way. But they don't have an arched palate, which is a bit of a problem. So the Deus Ignathus are a bit of an enigma. They don't have the same suction feeding adaptations that the modern walrus does. What they do have, though, is a very, very long palate, which would probably enable a worse version of suction feeding. And then, of course, things like Valenictus, with a big vaulted palate and no teeth aside from the tusks, we're pretty confident that it's a molluscivorous walrus with basically the same feeding adaptations as the modern walrus. So there's kind of a spectrum of molluscivores, fish eaters, possible squid eaters, some we don't know. And there's actually been one genus named Pelagiarctos from the fossil record of Bakersfield that was originally identified as a killer walrus. But we investigated it and it didn't really have any enamel or any microstructural adaptations for higher bite force or anything that you see in things like hyenas and wolves. Its teeth look just the same as like a harbor seal or a sea lion when you look at it under a scanning electron microscope.
Huh. Yeah, the benthic feeding patterns that you were originally like describing and how that connects to the gray whales was also really interesting to me. And I love now thinking about them as these sort of like windows into the past. Too, I didn't know that about them. And I'm just like really inspired to go out to the coast and look at the marine mammals that are out there and think about like their journeys here. We're at like 7:21 now, so I think it's probably a good time to wrap up, but I want to give Kathleen a chance to, if there's any last burning questions that you wanted to pose Bobby before we call it a night.
This has been so great. I learned a ton of things, and I think I have to digest a little bit before I have questions. But also, I'm excited. I know that Bobby is going to send Marisa a whole bunch of resources that we can like look at to learn more about walruses. I think one thing that's exciting is because it's not something I think of as being in Santa Cruz. It's not something I thought like, oh, like that's like, it seems so much more exotic and not like part of what I would want to be learning as I learn about sort of the holistic natural history of Santa Cruz. But clearly, that's not the case.
Yeah, and I love that it's connected to our changing like geologic landscape. It's all connected, and you just have to keep looking closer. And I have a hard time with fossil hunting and understanding what I'm looking at, but I think that I've got a better feel for it now based on you describing your process, on how it basically you just have to like take a moment to think about like, well, what is this shape? What does it remind me of? What's different about this compared to this? I mean, like the ankle bones that Wayne found. I'm like, how could you possibly know, A, that it's an ankle bone, B, that it came from a walrus? Like, that's the level that I'm at, but I feel like I'm getting closer. So,
and that ankle bone was only about 10% exposed when I first saw it.
wild. Yeah, I know Frank he gave a walk for us at the museum a couple weekends ago at Seabright Beach. And I did not know that there were fossils at Seabright Beach because it's a completely different kind of form of the Purisima Formation, very chalky. And it was like ghost shrimp sort of burrows and things like that. So different, had no idea. But he was also sharing stories about how like one of the big fossils that we have out in the garden, which Kathleen just recently wrote up a guide about, so I'll make sure to include that in the follow-up email as well, that when it was originally collected, it was collected because there was a skull in this matrix, and it wasn't until they got it to the museum that they realized that there was also like a flipper in there too, and just like so many surprises. And so many, like also the skull that the 14-year-old found, how it was so hidden, and you kind of just have to like, have faith that there's going to be something there.
You have to use your imagination and be really good at visualizing three-dimensional shapes.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's a neat, unique process, and also seems very tedious. So there's a lot of glamour with it, but also a lot of work, I could tell.
Yeah.
But okay, well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Bobby, for sharing your time and for all that you've given to the museum over the years. We hope to see you in person back in Santa Cruz soon. But for now, we're grateful that you're still studying our area from afar. And,
absolutely. Thank you guys so much for inviting me. I had a blast, and I would love to do this again.
Yeah, lots to talk
hello
about.
again to Dan and Anna.
Great. Well, and thanks, to everyone who's joining us tonight. Thanks for being a member. Got other member perks coming up in the future, and we'll see you again soon. So have a good night, everyone. And Bobby, when we close out right now, you're going to get kicked out too. So enjoy your evening. All right. Bye, guys.